Good evening and welcome. I just want to say hello to everyone who's joining. We do have the recording on and it's live stream right now as we wait for everyone to join. So as we're joining and getting started, I'm going to defer to the chair on deciding on the time that we want to kick off the meeting. I'll just jump in here. Adriel, are you able to come off of mute by chance?
I'm so sorry. My hearing went out. Did you ask me about you?
Oh, no problem. Yeah, so I was just suggesting that I would defer to you as to determine the right time to kick off the meeting and get started.
Oh, I, I think we can, not adjourn. I think we can call the meeting to order now. We're set 5:33. So let's get it going.
One of the housekeeping items that I have trouble tracking with myself, so I'm going to ask Alexander to help me a little bit, is whether or not we have quorum, where we were at, and where we're at in this process if it's required.
We do not have a majority of adult members joined to the committee yet, so it looks like for 3-year term adult members right now in the space, we have 3 people, and we also have our student member joining us here. So given that, it might make sense to hold for more folks to join. Um, Yeah, I'll keep watching our attendee list.
Alexandra, I think I have a question, and just this is in part of my learning. What do we do if we don't meet quorum?
Quorum is required for voting items. So I haven't actually experienced that at CBRC, that we haven't had a quorum. So that would be new for me.
Could discussions take place without any decisions being made among the folks who are present?
What do you think about that, Tammy? Have you ever encountered that situation with an advisory body? The quorum is needed for
For
voting.
decision making, that's what I was kind of alluding to in the if it's required to begin the meeting. Is it's been my experience that the meeting can still take place, but you would not be able to take action or make decisions. I'm a little conflicted like that as its purest answer is true. You're also producing a report and moving that through to the board. And so having a limited members present during some critical kind of conversation pieces might slow down or hinder the timeline in which this report is expected to be delivered. We're making our way kind of through here, and I'm admitting anyone who's asking that's a member of the committee. So I think the short answer is we can still go through. The meeting can still take place and the conversation could happen, but there might be some sort of catching up with colleagues that needs to happen outside of this. I can also drop in the chat the Q&A tracking log while we're waiting. Many of you are aware, Friday was a furlough day, and so we're trying to make up time and getting responses to questions, given the short week that we had and the time between our last meeting. So while we will have some of the questions answered, we're still working and connecting with staff on making sure we have the most accurate and complete information. I'm sure you can empathize as you're reading this data that the number, the object or function code doesn't always tell the full story. And so we want to make sure that's as accurate as possible.
So does the meeting need to be called to order to begin discussion?
Well, we already called the meeting to
We did,
order.
okay.
Wait,
In half a mile, turn left on the Northeast Forest.
sorry about my GPS.
And it seems like you might be ready to jump in. And you had a lot of the questions. So yeah.
And I am trying to read these, but these just came up in the last 10 minutes. So haven't had a chance to review the answers to the questions yet. But yes, so I sent through a number of questions, but I have two recommendations that I'd like the CBRC to consider, and we probably will need to summarize these and send them out to the rest of the committee since nobody's here. We can't do any voting. But one is an idea to increase transparency and how people can interact with the budget better. And one is a request for benchmarking of a particular number that is coming through the budget. So looking at the questions on the form and based on my own reading of the budget documents, I think one of the biggest issues with the budget as it is written now is that all that bond and all that debt money are all entangled with the financial decisions that are taking place inside the operating budget. And this gets in the way of one of the district's key goals right now, being rebuilding community trust, reversing enrollment declines, jumpstarting the fund, being transparency. And that if I am the CBRC, am having trouble figuring out what's going on in here, there's really very little hope that a regular old community member would be able to do so. So I want to share a couple of small examples of what I mean, and then one larger example. So everyone who's on the call here knows that we have a $56 million shortfall, which is leading to hundreds of job losses. But the budget also is increasing significantly on certain line items for next year. And anybody wants to follow along, it's on page 89 of volume 1 of the budget, which is the requirements by object table. Our textbook adoption is going up by $21 million. The budget for software is increasing by 800%, by another $21 million increase over this year's levels. Building and equipment maintenance up by $14 million. Property insurance up by $11 million. Repairs and maintenance up by $10 million. And legal services up by $10 million. Those are some of the bigger ticket items that collectively those 6 objects are increasing the budget $90 million headed into next year compared to where we were this year. And presumably, much of this is driven by the bond. Presumably, a lot of this is stuff that's happening because of the capital expenses, but I can't tell why these things are going up. And my guess is one of the reasons is that it's because the bond money is all mixed in there together. That's not the case. I definitely want to understand that why. But this is the transparency gap that I think we as a group could ask the district to close. This is on page 89 of volume 1, which if you're looking at the PDF is actually PDF page 101 because they're off. So those are 6 different tables. I also have this in an Excel sheet. There's a way, I don't know if there's a way to like share the Excel sheet or if that's not allowed because we'd be talking to each other. Or I could project it if anybody has preference. So that's sort of idea number 1 within this request for transparency. The second being, there's a disconnect between the per pupil spending. When we look at volume number 2, it shows a little over $11,000 per student is going from our budget straight into the schools. $11,000. That's what we talked about. It comes up at the board meetings. But when we look at budget volume 1, construction and debt are all mixed into the operating budget. And so then it shows we spend $66,000 per student per year, which is a really big number. And we were talking about 16% last week or whenever we met. That's what the 16 is the 11 out of 66. But that's not the right comparison here because we need to remove the bond money and we need to remove the debt money to understand how much are we spending from our operating budget on each student. And in that case, when I run the numbers, and I please invite others on this call to run them as well, or to take a look at mine. When we look at the PPS budget per pupil without construction bonds, the operating budget is $26,000 per student and a little higher, a little change. That's still a really big difference between $11,000 per student in one deck and $26,000 per student in the other deck. That discrepancy is part of the challenge in transparency. I don't doubt that those costs are going to real and legitimate places, but where are they going? And how can we review a budget when there's no way to tell what's making up the difference between what lives in one and what lives in the other? So my suggestion would be that we as a group that we recommend to the board that headed into next year, probably not for this year, but headed into next year, the finance group develop and publish a supplemental budget that separates out the capital construction and debt service from the operating expenditures so that we can see where there are decisions being made that are reversible. Instead of like when we send the questions through, the answer has been something like, well, most of that's locked funds. We can't spend that, but it's all most. We'd like to see what decisions are at hand and which ones are locked away in the capital ones where we can't do anything about it. So a supplemental budget that separates the two. I think a comprehensive per pupil analysis of the operating budget. Like when people say, oh, you're doing the budget thing, like, where is the money going? If I have $1, how much of it is going to teachers? How much of it is going to PERS? How much of it is going here and there? And that's one of the ways that the public understands a budget. I think that'd be a really useful communication tool for people to be able to see where the money is going and hopefully feel like then they understand how the funds are being spent. And if possible, if we have a great, Eli, maybe one of your classmates, visual design, a visual that shows how the dollar flows from a central district level to the classroom so that people can see how the money is moving around as it goes to the class. So I'm going to pause there. I do have one other thing, but that's definitely my big idea request from my review of the budget this year.
I want to note that if I'm not mistaken, in the notes from the meeting that Karanja and Vice Chair had, those were some of the requests that were in that meeting, right? Those are some takeaways. Am I misrepresenting that, Alexandra?
No, there were some, you're not misrepresenting that at all. And I did wonder if it would be helpful to walk through some of the ways that this is presented in the budget document, which I know, Anne, you have been reviewing in a really detailed way. And so if it is not helpful, then I'm totally fine if we choose not to spend time on that. But I do think that in many ways our budget documents is answering this question from different points of view. We have some really helpful reports that have been useful in prior years in understanding the year-over-year change, and that also include prior year actuals, so you can see a multi-year trend with a lot of specificity. So if it's helpful, we can go there. But I understand, Anne, that you've already been reviewing it and are seeing or seeing some gaps, I think is how you phrased it.
I think my question would be, I am surely not a budget document expert. Is there a report that pulls out the construction bond and that pulls out the debt? So we can see where the spending money goes. And can you point that out to us?
And so just to clarify, when you say like the spending money, are you just focused on like money that's going specifically to students as opposed to like construction? I totally agree with you in that it's not clear sort of like how much money is actually going into the schools versus being set aside for other things. I'm just not totally following like, and maybe we should think about what we want the specific like parameters to be around this request. Like, I mean, if it's just pulling out the construction only, I don't know if that's necessarily the right answer. And I agree. I think I saw the same thing you did on like was it like purchase services going up exponentially compared to everything else, and it's not clear exactly what's driving that. And that was one of the questions I actually asked that I think we just got an FAQ like response to. But yeah, I think that the level of depth around like what's driving these big increases in the budget document itself is lacking. And I do agree that I think at the very least, like some more detail around that would be a good recommendation.
One of the clarifying questions I have, because I'm thinking about how to present this, and the All Funds report, ironically, is a new report to provide additional transparency that wasn't provided before. And my hope with that, all the report you're referencing, is that when people honed in on something specific in a fund, they could look at the broader picture. I think it's possible that the opposite might be happening here, that's creating a frustration point. And so I'm going to just, on page 101, I'm holding the book, so we're just going to go to the good old paper.
Was it
page
helpful?
101.
Should I screen share?
Okay. Yeah. If you could screen share, then anyone watching online can follow along as well. The general fund, the Fund 100, that is our operating fund. That is where we have our choices, where we our are making decisions. That's where that 56 million shows up. And there is an effort to describe this, and I joke a little bit about, you can overpower with information, and that can also make it a little more challenging to navigate. So I just know that while I'm stating that we have information in the book, if I had shared with you the number of times I said, I know it's there, but it's in the middle of a bunch of things. So, so this kind of represents where we have choice and where we don't have choice, as in it's legally prescriptive or something like that. So the all funds report is supposed to pull back away from to look at big picture. For example, we divested in a certain area in the general fund, but then you see this big increase overall. Maybe it's actually being supplemented by grants where it wasn't before. And when I say supplement, I don't mean supplant. There's very clear rules around supplement for grant accounting. But SIA might be covering specifically more things general fund had in the past. And so on page 101, that general fund detail, that's going to be our operating budget. That's where you're looking at where's our gap, where's our regular revenue coming in, and how are we making choices on how we're spending with kids. And then similarly on page 109, this is where it gets a little messy, and this is where I'm thinking through like how this might provide more clarity. The 200 level funds, we break those out. So we don't have multiple general funds, but we do have several 200 level funds. And some of those, we have more flexibility than others in choice. SIA is one where we have a plan, and that actually goes through a lot of engagement to even get the plan to go to the state for approval. So when it comes to the budget process, it is going to feel kind of like there's no choice, but there is a little bit, and as long as it fits within the plan. And that's found on Fund 251 specifically. Measure 98 is very prescriptive and has very specific categories as well. And that one, although it has the same level of requirements, might feel a little more restrictive in the planning. And this all comes from our integrated guidance. And so it kind of what you're describing, what do we have discretion on and what we don't? We clearly have discretion on the Fund 100. There's no question. That's where you should dig in for sure. The 200s, now we're getting mixed, because if we go to nutrition services, we're going to just be feeding kids. Nobody gets to choose much about that. We're going to make sure our kids come to school and they get fed. And it's going to cost what it does, but we're going to try and maintain a program that has good quality food and reduces the amount per meal that we're paying. And that takes a little more nuance to read through. And I don't think we've teed that up well for you. And I'm kind of just thinking through how could we make that a little more clear. I can go through every 200 level fund if you want. There's a fund header that describes it. Our grant funds we're required to do that a certain way. Fund 205, Fund 299, and I'll pause there.
But does the 200 level detail tell us whether the software is going to classrooms or to construction?
Oh, so there's a point of clarification. All right, so in the function 4,000, that's our capital in the 200. And so if we look here, I'm trying to look in real quickly, if you can scroll down to a function level in Fund 205, and let's see if there's any capital. I don't have every number memorized. I apologize. And so what we're seeing there is a small amount of capital, and it's that 12,000 or 12,156. So we've got that in there. So that is the amount that's going to capital for the building acquisition in that function.
But we can't.
When it comes to the bond,
20 million being spent on software is going to classrooms or going to construction. Right, because each function and object is reported only
Yes.
out of the full pie.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yes.
everything's all mixed together, and we can see individual increases, but we don't know what's
Mhm.
driving those increases, whether it's the half of the budget that's sort of headed towards kids or the half of the budget that's headed toward building.
Yeah, so that would be true. And some of that I would say like, and I don't, this is going to sound skirting, I promise you I'm not. But I'm going to tell you right now in full transparency, 100% of our plans will not materialize next year because we are not fortune tellers, but we're going to do our best estimate here. What that means is our staffing we've set, that's not going to change, right? Unless more students show up or some other need is filled, and then we will have to be responsive to kids. And so when there are certain things that we have planned for, that we have traditionally spent, but if there is not an organizational need for that thing, in kids come in, we're not going to spend money on things we don't necessarily need to do. So this sets the appropriation maximum, and we're looking at those high level things. We can provide a function object comparison. So you can say within this fund and this function, these are the objects that are being purchased. And just knowing that that would be the ceiling or the most based on function, but a budget approval is based on the function and fund level, not on the object level. And so while it is possible that the board approves a budget with a fund, function, and object, that the authority the board is setting is within that function level. I see Michelle's jumping in here soon as well, so she may have some more to add to that. But we can provide the detail. I just want to make sure that it is transparent and provides the right information and allows you to focus in on kind of these major themes. And Michelle, I'll pause here to let you jump in if you wanted to add anything.
If Michelle doesn't, can I ask a question?
Yeah,
So, so maybe one of the things that might be helpful. So I know, like, so I'm reading the response that I sent in for that purchase services question, and I see it says like in the response it says purchase services is increasing. Sorry, the general fund budget for purchase services is increasing 5.6%. Like, where would we go like on here among all the different sort of like ways to look at this, where like we would find that percentage? Like, could we conclude that in here?
I can walk through that.
Yeah, I think that'd be
Just
helpful.
I'm running the screen share with the budget document. I did want to acknowledge that um, to your question, and I'm looking at the general obligation bond fund, Fund 450. When I scroll a few pages into this report, I can see the object for computer software, and then I can see what you had called out, the 19.8 million. So we have a bond funded computer software project that is budgeted at 19.8 million, and that's represented here. So digging into the detail of some of these sub funds will answer some of the questions, I hope. So if we wanted to focus on our operating fund, the general fund, and look specifically at purchase services, all these funds follow the same presentation. So we start with revenue table, and then we go to requirements by function. And then those same expenses are presented differently when we look at them by object. So this is what we're actually spending money on or what we plan to spend money on. And so when we zoom in to purchase services, we can see we have a total here in the general fund is 672 million is our total expected spend for purchase services in the general fund. And you can see the detail that's broken out here. These are what we expect or plan to spend on within purchase services.
So like if software was being used in this by the general fund, like there should be a software like line item here.
Right,
Oh, yeah, right
yeah.
there,
So we
computer
have that
software.
within
Okay,
supplies and materials, and it's here at
got it.
3.7 million.
Okay, got it. So of the 19 million, then 3.7 million of the computer software is being allocated to the general fund.
So the funds are budgeted and accounted for separately, so that would be in addition to. So we have a bond compensable software project that is budgeted at 19 million. In addition to that, we have a general fund budget line items that total the 3 million that you saw here.
Got it. Okay. Thank you for clarifying that.
And so if we wanted to follow the same logic for another item, say, oh, I'm a member of the public and I noticed that textbook adoption is $20 million more next year than this year. What's the process that person would go through to figure out why we're spending $20 million more on textbooks next year compared to this year?
We're reporting on some of the high level detail in the budget. So you can see what we're sharing here across the columns is what did we actually spend for that object code for the prior 3 years? What is the current year budget for this current school year? And what are we proposing and then approving and adopting for the upcoming year? So that's the level of detail that's visible here. There is some other narrative in the budget document that that I think is helpful. I think it is helpful to ground into some of the other reports that we have. So, for example, we have a strategic investments report that's included in the informational section that highlights some of the strategic initiatives that the district is planning on funding for the upcoming year. Sometimes that has included curriculum adoption projects that are articulated there. It's here in this section. We also describe the budget at a high level in the budget overview. And so some of the information may be there if we've highlighted it as a change or a new investment. That's a pretty typical practice, is to highlight things that are new or different in the budget overview. So it may have been included there. Tammy or Michelle, I'm not sure if you have any other ideas for the pathway that a community member can follow to learn more about specific line items.
I think it might end up being in a similar way that you described a little earlier. This one I happen to know is there's a lot in the bond fund associated. And so you could look at the all fund report and then go to the bond fund report for that same object code and then deduce how much of that is coming from bond versus how much of that is coming from other funds. And you would be able to see that in each fund. And so I think that's page 172, where the textbook adoption, we can see that line there carrying through. And then if we were to look at the all funds line for that same thing, that would tell you how much specifically is on bond, but would not tell you, it would not necessarily tell you how much is general fund versus special revenue fund. And so then you would need to look in those others. And I've kind of made note about doing a fund roll up so that you could see that. So instead of looking at each individual 200 fund, you could see that across all. One of the danger points is, like I called out before, nutrition services kind of rolls in. And so there might be some mixing up of what is within the ability to influence versus what is required. Textbook adoption should fall outside of nutrition, and so therefore would be a safe roll up.
And to Shane's point earlier about what do we consider in our, I don't know what we would call operating budget, like the general fund, yes, but part of the finagling, right, that's been going on is pulling some instruction out of general fund and putting it into, there's now almost $100 million of instruction that's taking place outside of the general fund. That is presumably money that's being decided. Maybe that's a question. How much of that $100 million of instruction that lives outside of the general bond do we have control over? Is that something that would be considered as part of our operating budget?
Generally, no, because within the grants, we would have certain grants requirements. So when we apply for a grant, we put in what the plan is, or, we have to meet the requirements of that grant. And so if we don't spend the money in the way that the grantor expected, then we would need to not accept those funds or return those funds. And so that those instances would live outside of Typically speaking, general fund is the major place where I would say there's a little bit more influence, and I think it should happen both within CBRC discussion, but also within our uniform grant application window and our community involvement there is providing community input on how we spend the money when we're applying for those grants from ODE, right? That's going to be two places where you can really have your voice heard about influence and matter of influence. And so front end on application, here in this planning, some of the questions that you, when reviewing specifically SIA funds, that may elicit more of the questions that, does this align with the strategy of or the application that we put in for integrated grants, and are there things on there that do not align? And generally speaking, we're trying to avoid that, but that might be a place where we're pushing in or pulling out from general fund. Did I answer that all the way through? Permission to loop back later and ask questions. Yes.
I think the reason we were talking about how much of it is controllable and how much isn't is trying to understand the dollars per pupil. Is this a challenge that you guys have tackled before? How do we communicate where the money is going? Because, you know, the operating budget and then what we have in volume 2, they're really different, like concerningly different. And I'm sure there's full documentation, like all of those expected expenditures exist, but we can't see them. They're not in the budget because it's not defined what goes into the dollars per student and what doesn't. There's an et cetera in the definition.
For volume 2 specifically.
Yeah, when we're saying we spend $11,000 per student, and that's a number that I hear people on the playground say we spend $11,000 per student. I heard it in the board meeting the other night. People talk about that number, but if you take out construction of this, right, you're either at 33,000 or you're 26,000, depending on how many of those other funds you remove from your denominator.
Right. Yeah, we typically don't calculate our debt service on a dollar per student, although again, fully transparent, we do pay our PERS debt obligation, which is our unfunded actuarial liability, out of a debt service fund. And if we were not doing that, we would be paying PERS costs, which would be coming out of our operational budget and grants and anywhere we're paying payroll. So there is, you're naming probably one of the biggest challenges stepping in here that I've kind of encountered is the question of what to include and exclude. The answer is different depending on who you ask. And so what one person might describe as that is at a school and this is in central office. Someone else might describe slightly different in a different way. And actually I was trying to look through in volume 2 to identify some of the positions that are here that are housed centrally, that are directly impacting students. And so I know we have staff that are physically in this building, they're assigned to a central office, and they carry a caseload for students in serving, and they are called upon when needed. And we have different staff that do that. And the question I would then pose is do we call that a school support because they are not there unless they're called upon? So they're not available to help out, and they're there to do that job, and then they come back for their reporting or other legal obligation.
Could you name an
that's kind of
example?
that question. Yeah.
Sorry, could you name an example of that position?
So the one coming to mind probably isn't the best to call out, but we have a Title IX incident response investigator position that definitely is at the heart of serving our kids in our buildings, and is not listed anywhere in volume 2 and is not in that book, is assigned to a central department. and is really considered central services, central office services specifically. I think if you expand it even further out, Alexandra, I just want to be accurate when I speak to this, and we have a long list of departments. So I'm thinking through some of our equity pieces here, and I'm pulling up on the side here at departments that are included in central. And there are other people that are certainly student-centered, and we will never find in volume 2. And so what I'm hearing though is there's a need to understand that. What I'm curious about, so that I can frame it the right way, is, and what I mean by that, just present it in a way that's useful, is what decision making would happen with a result of that information. Would we work to protect those positions? Would we work to identify them differently? And you don't need to answer that in the moment. But I want to make sure that we produce something that's helpful for this decision-making body.
Well, I
Just
think,
to
oh, sorry, go ahead. No, I was
I
just
wasn't-
thinking, go ahead, Alexandra, and I will mute.
I wasn't sure, Tammy, if you were asking a question about some of the other global services in central support, and if you wanted me to look for that.
I was hoping you could maybe pick out that or share the key with me, and I can pull out some other positions that might be examples of at the heart of it, it's student-facing work, but won't show up in a report that way.
Okay, how about I pivot to that and then we can go to Angela.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to speak to the question of what decision making is dependent on that information, I think this body is working on impacting decision making as well as helping build trust in the community with the district's budget process. And part of what I've heard Ann say a couple of times is that folks are saying there's 11K going to students, but then they're looking at volume 2 and that's not the math. So if we're able to see, okay, that 11K includes the Title IX coordinator, the civil rights coordinator, the ResJ department, like that would help folks understand that when we say 11,000, that means this in schools and this outside of schools that is specifically serving students. And I think it would help for decision-making processes to think about, like, you know, each school is supposed to have someone who is a Title IX coordinator per school. And then they connect with the Title IX coordinator at the district. Is that a system that works? Is that a redundancy? Is that something that we need to have by law? And we can't have that conversation if we're not knowing, if, you know, like lay folks are not seeing here's where all this money is going, that the news and everyone is telling me is going directly to my student because of the per pupil spending phrasing.
You know, that is actually really helpful. And a couple examples is school psychs and speech pathologists will never show up in volume 2 currently. Like that's not how it's structured. So more examples. I hear what you're saying. So I think there is a way to pivot some of that, share which departments have FTE that we call, specialized services versus the school central support. So then this body could look, this committee can look at any sort of redundancies or questions around that.
I appreciate, Angela, you jumping in and saying that much more eloquently. Oh, sorry. Did someone have their hand up? Sorry.
Yeah, when in volume 2, when it says how much is, how many teachers there are in a particular school. So if there's 10 teachers in one school and 10 teachers in another school, is it going to come out the same amount of money, or is it the actual amount those particular teachers get?
It's going to reflect those teachers' salaries. So the FTE would be a much more accurate representation or consideration of the resources within the school versus the dollars. And where that's critical is that we're not making decisions based on how much a person costs. We're making decisions on the right educator, the best educator.
Okay, so it would, if you had a brand new teacher, the amount of money spent would show up there the same as if you had a 30-year teacher.
I guess what I'm saying is that it'll show up as more money.
More money with the experience.
Yeah. So you'll see a higher dollar per student, even with this same number of staff.
Okay. So your actual number spent per student could have the same number of teachers in the building.
That
Okay.
is correct. Yes.
Thank you.
And on the topic of that table, it's not teachers, right? It's FTE, it's adults in the building rather than teachers in the building. So the distribution of teachers versus maybe lower paid FTE would also impact the dollars that you see in that table. Is that right?
For the dollar side, yeah, that would show the blend of the mix of all staffing, licensed, classified, non-rep.
Perfect.
Mhm.
So to what I was wanted to say, Angela, thank you for saying much more eloquently than I did. Yes, it's hard to define these things. We got to figure out what works to define these things. But the district could just define them. Here's category 1, and it includes all these kinds of people. Here's category 2, it includes all these kind of people. And then there wouldn't be the question anymore. Then people would be able to point to that and say, I might not agree with the definition, but at least I know what it is. I think that would be a good step toward transparency.
That's great. We can produce a list, I think now. I was going to add that. Whoever's taking notes today will add that in, and then that's something we can provide on the Q&A for this round to create more clarity, and then look at improving our document for next year.
I did also want to offer one of the reports that have been helpful for this committee and really visible sometimes through the process is this report, which is a FTE or full-time equivalent by major function and employee type. And so, Anne, this is almost similar. I really appreciated the approach that you took when you looked at the instructional function and the support services function. And then you asked us in your question that you submitted to break it down by object. That made a lot of sense to me and is actually really similar to what we see here. Although you were focused on dollars overall, there's a difference here that we've been discussing, but this just presents FTE. This is for all funds. So most of our FTE is budgeted in Fund 100 and Fund 200. We have smaller amount of FTE in Fund 400 and 600, but this will include the entire system of FTE. And you can see that we have created, or these are the categories by object type for the different FTE types. And we've broken it out by function. So, for example, when we look at primary instructional activities, that's classified within this regular programs function, you can see the trend over time here in our system. And we have a subtotal here, so you can see at a high level how that's changed. And we break out support services at this kind of middle level of detail so that you can see these trends. And I think this report is helpful because you don't get as lost in some of the detail that exists in some of the other reporting. So in case that's helpful, that is on page 205 of volume 1.
I think another, just from that page in the budget, the 204, 205, that brings up some questions as well around like, can we get a definition or parsing out the admin license definition between superintendent, academic administrators and directors versus principals and APs and VPs. So I think that's another one. I know that student rep to the board had asked for something like that around like how much does each position cost? Because folks keep saying chop from the top. What does the top actually mean? And I think having that parsed out would help folks kind of understand the difference in costs between, you know, the folks who are in our buildings every single day helping hold it down, and the folks who might be a little bit further away from that direct in the school's daily kind of position. Is there any way to get that kind of that level of information?
Yeah, so I can work on gathering some of that together. Some of these requests, they don't come natively. I'm just going to be honest. They don't come natively out of the software very easily to pivot and move. So it takes a little bit more time to compile, and I want to be mindful of the reporting deadline that you have and the timeline. I also was considering, you know, what the conversation looks like annually and when we start getting questions and gathering questions. So I'm going to work on that as well. We still have more questions to wrap up that came in last week from the meeting, and then over the weekend, with Friday being a furlough day, we're just a little bit behind and being able to be as responsive as we would have liked in between these meetings.
For
But I
sure.
will work on that.
I just want to note that I know we had with our chairs a meeting with Alexander on the 16th of April, and one of the things we did ask for was central reductions clearly separated from school reductions and making it like clear what is separated. So, you know, I know that it was a lot of stuff that we asked for on that document. I'm looking at the notes right now. But I think it's important to respond to some of the concerns folks have been lifting up, or some of the demands that folks have been lifting up, with just the clear data of like, what does that even mean? You know, like when we say chop from the top, like who is that and what does that actually mean, and how much would that actually bring in versus other places where we can look at different action items. Go ahead, Shi.
Yeah, it's kind of going off of that, I think between this and what Anne was sort of saying at the top, I think maybe one of our comments around transparency should really be like the volume should have more differentiation between like in class, like in school, central office, construction. You know, these like I think we kind of already have these broader categories in other parts of the volume, but it's harder to then cross apply it where we're seeing like the actual hard numbers. And so maybe more uh, information and work around that in future volumes might be something that we would want to recommend.
I mean, I'll just like, and I'm sorry I was late, everyone. I think I mentioned in the chat, I had to take some of the basketball practice, and some basketball background noise you might be hearing. But I'd strongly +1 that, mainly because, and even if it's for some reason we can't get this reported out exactly the way we want this year, to make it a priority for next year, because it just seems, I think people on this committee even might have different opinions about sort of how we view the right balance of central office versus school-facing staff, but like it's such a sticking point in the basic understanding of these conversations that it seems like it needs to be a top priority of the district to report this out in a way that everyone can agree that, okay, we might have different opinions about the solution, but we're working from a common definition and a common understanding of what sort of direct school-facing spending staff versus central office, and we can go from there, because it feels like when this comes up, and it's unfortunately probably going to come up in future years too, given the financial outlook, we spend so much time going around and around on just agreeing on the basic set of facts. It would be great to get to a situation where we're not doing it together.
I wonder if there are any other kind of questions or answers to questions that folks submitted that folks want to kind of lift up or get clarification on or point out. as connected to some of the themes that we've already identified around, and I'll just list what I have: the transparency and legibility for the public, how realistic the assumptions are in some of the budgeting, the analysis on blended classrooms, clarifying the limitation of use of dollars between bond, general fund, et cetera. Preservation of programs, and are these funds being reduced proportionally? Questions around PERS, and then encouraging advocacy at the state level, as well as recommending alternative funding sources. So have any questions that you've shared addressed any of those themes, or anything that folks want to lift up?
I think on that last category around like alternative funding sources, I don't know if it's necessarily funding sources, but maybe it's alternative expense sources. Just thinking of like contracting services and whether there's alternative options to find, different providers. And I don't know what the process is. I assume there's some type of like RFP process or something that we need to go through to, if we want to change who is providing some of these third-party services. But just seeing such a large increase there when we're trying to cut so much makes me wonder if that is something that should be suggested.
Thank you. Yeah, there was an answer to one of my questions around like cutting map testing for the state interim assessment tool, and there was the state interim assessment tool is only third through fifth or third through eighth. I'm looking for the question right now, but the boxes are very big. And we need it from K through 8. And it is, tens of thousands of dollars. And in my mind as a professional educator, like, assessments is part of what I learned how to do in my master's program. It's part of what we do as educators. It's a lot of districts have paid educators to work on banks of questions for interim assessments that then get used district-wide. Would that be a lower cost to have that happen connected to standards once every couple of years than having to continue to contract out every year with MAP? That's what came to my mind when you said that, Shane, of just like, how can we look at some of these contracts? Is there a different way to possibly spend less and still get quality work, whether it's another contractor or employees we currently have? Yeah, Eli.
I might be misremembering, but I feel like very early on in this meeting process, I heard someone mentioning that there was like a state-sponsored alternative instead of MAPS testing. Am I correct in remembering that? And
Yes.
what's our decision point for choosing MAPS test over the state system? And would that be a decision we would want to revisit? Just wondering about that.
Let me see if I can find the answer for you. It is on line 31 of the questions asked in meetings. And the answer was that now ODE interim assessments were approved by the Board of Ed to be used. And it shared that ODE assessments cover grades 3 through 8 only, and the required interim assessments must be provided K8, which creates an assessment gap that would need to be filled by one of the other 3 assessment choices. And it shares over the past 3 years, we've spent an average of $218,000 on MAP growth contract each year. We're also required to give a dyslexia screener and have been using MAP fluency to meet that ODE requirement. And that cost has been approximately $70,000 per year. So that's where I was talking a little bit about, like, could we create assessments, interim assessments, locally to offset some of that cost? Is it possible to maybe even reduce it to just K through 2 as a contract and then use the ODE interims for 3 through 8. But that answer is on line 31.
Cool. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Mhm. Oh yeah, Anne.
I have a second sort of topic to bring up, and it was one that I just got an answer to just now, so I will include the answer at the end of my question. As a bit of background, the National Center for Education Statistics publishes benchmarks to help districts determine how their spending stacks up against the national average. And one thing that they publish is the proportion of the district operating budget that is spent on instruction, and they do define this with instruction, not support services, not enterprise operations, not nutrition services, because nutrition services, like you said, it bucks all the categories and it's tricky to keep track of. So they define their categories. Nationally, the average is 61% spent on instruction. The lowest 10% of states are at 56% or less. I think the lowest is 53 or 54. I've taken a crack at estimating this for PPS. Again, not an accountant. Our budget next year calls for 55 million on instruction. And then if you add in the support services and enterprise, where it's explicitly named by NCES, when we do the math, we see that only 53% of our funds are spent on instruction. That's much lower than most of the states that are shared by NCES. And if you include the cost of transfers and contingencies, and I don't know how NCES deals with those, then the number goes down to 51. But it's an 8-point gap that at PPS's scale can represent a really substantial difference in the type of resources that's reaching the classrooms, or being in central office, or being in this special service, wherever it is. It's an 8-point reduction in instructional services compared to the national average. And I did, during this call, because of the discussion around, is it general fund, is it operating budget, I reran it with just the general fund numbers, exactly the same. Still 53% for instruction out of the general fund. And you know, some of you may be thinking how this interacts with other features of education in Oregon. And this is a little bit of the response, but it's compounded by the fact that each of our instructional dollars purchases less instruction here in Oregon than in most states, because we have a short school year, because we have strong teacher compensation, and because the high PERS contributions come out of the instructional piece, right? If we look at the way the budget's structured, PERS lives inside instruction, and it's still only 53%. It's not that the PERS is squishing it down. I've taken out the debt service. PERS lives inside the 53%. So our students might be receiving fewer instructional resources than the per pupil spending might imply. And other people might be thinking, how is this impacting different student groups? People from students from well-resourced families might be able to compensate for instructional gaps. They get a tutor, they get enrichment. But students who don't have those resources, depend entirely on the public schools for learning, they're going to be the most harmed by receiving a low share of instruction. And the response that we got here, and what I'd like to talk about, is that the instructional spend is compressed by high fixed personnel costs, such as PERS and healthcare. That lives inside the instructional cut. It's not compressing it. It's making it so less money gets to the student because more is going to PERS and healthcare from the 53%, unless I'm understanding it incorrectly, in which case, please correct me. And also, alongside growth in non-classroom support roles. That's the part I want to talk about. Our support services group is so much larger compared to what we're seeing at the national level. What has happened where so much of our money is ending up in the support services role? Again, we're asking, it might get back to the same idea of let's define these categories. Let's talk about how much money is going into each of these categories, because our support services appear to this layperson to be very large compared to some of the other benchmarks. And so my suggestion would be that one thing that we as a committee might recommend would be to have actual financial experts, people like you, Tammy, and Alexandra, Michelle, to run a legitimate financial benchmarking and to look and see how our instructional proportion, how our support services levels compare to either national averages or to other peer sort of urban school districts that we look up to around the country, and understand if there are certain places where our support services is squeezing out instruction to make sure that that's not then impacting students all around our district.
Yeah, thank you, Anne. I mean, this was part of the Oregon Secretary of State audit that was done in January 2019. One of the quotes from that audit is that PPS has more money to spend per student than any of its state and national peer districts, but the district is spending proportionally less on instruction and more on support services than many of its peers. So that was from the state Secretary of State's office in January 2019. And then there was an update in 2022. And it pointed out some of the recommendations, like you said, like some benchmarking as a recommendation for transparency. What does it look like compared to other districts so that we can identify where we should be making cuts? And ask for reporting on potential savings and highlighting like places where that savings could happen. So it's not something new that you're reporting, and you are backed by the Oregon Secretary of State at the time in asking those same questions. And I wonder too, because I asked the question about ELD, speaking to like how much of that funding is actually going to students, and those most impacted will be those who maybe don't have access to other educational enrichment. In that answer I received was that like there was a weighted loss of ELD student population of 7.1%. And it was a decrease overall of 3.8% since 2023-24. But it also points out that the reduction in FTE is 23.3%. So I guess that's kind of like to the same question. When we're receiving a certain amount of funding for certain populations, why would that population decrease not be proportional in the staffing decrease that serves that population? And I'm pointing out ELD because it's very specific and like legally focused. Like you wouldn't be teaching ELD and something else necessarily. You're teaching ELD to students who are English language learners. And to have there be like a 3.8% reduction in ELD students from 23 to 25, a 7.1% reduction in their weighted student number, but a 23.3% FTE reduction and an increase of their ratios, it's like, then where's that funding going? And why is that loss so dramatic? Yeah, Andy.
Just reflecting on Anne's question, I think it's a good question. I'll just say my experience, both working in another very large district and sort of as part of my day job, seeing how some of the stuff plays out in other districts, is sometimes the larger and more complex districts actually have good reason to have larger shares of expenses in the support services bucket. And that said, I think to me, this gets back to what we were talking about earlier about a need to offer a like layman's definition of what exactly we are talking about in the different buckets. Like to me, that's the root cause of the like people not understanding this, and for good reason. I think benchmarking is great. I think the starting point is what we were talking about earlier about just getting a clear sense of, how much of the different buckets really represents student-facing, staff spending in schools versus simply dispersed away in the classroom in the way you framed it. And like I completely agree that that needs to be easier for people to understand. And then we can talk however much we want about like we think something is maybe not a good use of funds or not, but the baseline is a common understanding of what we're talking about.
Yeah, I can jump in just a little bit to offer a little piece of information regarding support services. And so just honing in on the general fund, you'll notice that operation of plant maintenance and student transportation is a pretty large footprint of that support function. And so we have significantly aging buildings and infrastructure that require a lot of maintenance and upkeep. And I would be curious to see when we're looking at peer districts, what their makeup is. That's a little bit more qualitative than quantitative to some degree, but we can look at the numbers to see like what are the age of buildings, and then understanding what peer districts to select from is also going to be really critical. And then transportation, we have a big area of transportation compared to some districts, and in some other states they transport much further, but we have a significant distance between where we can store the buses and then picking up students, and so those transportation costs are really significant there. And so I guess part of that is when you're looking at trade-offs, what I would offer is, or that evaluation is, this is an example in general fund of, are we getting kids to school or are we putting teachers in front of kids? And I'm never going to pit one over another. I just want to kind of ground in that piece where yes, there's a lot happening there. I know that transportation department is digging into and evaluating what the services they're providing, the ways in which we can reduce what I call the budget footprint in that area as well. And you're calling that out rightfully so. There is a lot happening in support services. Additionally, there are some school positions that land in support services, counselors. I'm actually not confident on librarians if they're support or instruction. And I don't want to misspeak on that.
I think they're instruction because they provide classes, like kids go to library.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, the district that I came from before here, they were not, they were classified employees. So thank you for clarifying that. And then you'll see like instructional staff development. This function level report is going to give you some really good detail as to where we're investing within support services for that fund. And then we can kind of dig in to any of those areas if there's a question. And I'll pause there.
Thank you.
We're on page 103 of the budget document, FYI.
And since I mentioned the Secretary of State audits, I'm just putting the website, the PPS website where those audits live in the chat. For the sake of transparency, I'm saying it out loud.
Since we're talking about transportation, I have a question that touches on transportation. Being that it looks like we're planning a 13% reduction to the talented and gifted budget, which is budget 1210. And the comment explaining why suggests that student participation is low, but TAG students who are not at access schools tend to have minimal access to TAG programs. So that might be why participation is low, is because it's not there. And that reduction being coupled with the proposed elimination of all transportation to access, which is part of how that access was a solution to make it equitable across the district. So now any family whose student can't afford to drive or transport them will have no access to TAG at all within PPS. So how will reducing the budget allow PPS to comply with its legal requirement to provide programming to TAG students?
I don't, yeah, go ahead, Angela.
Well, I do want to give some context as well at the school level, because there is a TAG coordinator at each school, and we used to have TOSAs that specifically work to help educators with TAG. Like I remember my first year, I was like, I have all these students in 4th grade, and some are still reading at a pre-literacy level, and some are reading at a middle school level. How do I support my TAG students? And I had a TOSA who came down, a teacher on special assignment, and just supported me with like curriculum that I can embed into my classroom. We started doing Genius Hour as a TAG enrichment. And so there are ways that schools can do that, but we no longer have TOSAs like that. So I think it also speaks to the like larger conversation of when we're switching, when we're deciding where those services and that funding goes, is it going to support folks in doing that work at students' neighborhood schools? Is it going through TOSAs? Is it going through apps? Is it going through, the access as a school? Like what what are the ways that we're funding and supporting TAG? And if the only or the main way is through access, are kids actually, no pun intended, accessing their TAG services if they don't have access to transportation? But I just wanted to also give that context that there is a coordinator in each school, and there should be more support for that, but that support has been eliminated over the past few years. Oh, and Andy, did you still have a hand up? Nope.
I did.
Yeah.
Although, Anne, were you asking? Were you looking for a response on your question about the TAG services from the district before?
Is that something that the CBRC would want to raise as a question, I suppose? Noting the cut to TAG in that it's the financial cut, the financial reduction coupled with the proposed elimination of transportation.
I see. So you're like
Without
a question
about the budget.
Yeah.
Got it.
Got it.
Because transportation is not in the budget. It's the context.
Yeah, I had submitted a question asking about, and just full transparency, I have 2 kids at Access, so I'm not going to pretend to be a unbiased over here. I did submit a question asking, which I don't think has been answered yet, around sort of exactly how much the district is projecting to save by cutting transportation. I am curious to hear that, and I'll just kind of co-sign. I think your framing of my wondering that I think I would have if I didn't have kids at Access about that decision. My question, just to back up, was we were talking a minute ago about maybe one source of higher share of spending on support services being our aging buildings. Has the district done any modeling on, like, I know the superintendent's been really clear that the point of doing consolidation is not to save money in the short term. It's about sort of, are we spreading our resources too thin? But over the long run, are we expecting to see any savings on this front from consolidations, or has the district done any preliminary thinking about that? And if this is just opening a can of worms, I'm happy to table it, but I do have a wondering about that.
That work is just getting started. We do not, in full transparency, we do not expect it to save a lot of money because you're lifting students and all the staffing and putting them in another building. And the students still need teachers that are with a reasonable class size. So we're not going to see a huge savings there. What we should see is better quality access to resources within a building. So instead of having to choose someone who's floating between 3 buildings, you should start to see more alignment of a person who's in a building more consistently. There's a bigger question that I'm sure is looming around sale of assets and what do you do with the building, and those would all fall in one-time revenue things that would come in, and they would not resolve any structural things. So not to say that they wouldn't add value or the decision shouldn't be made with them, they absolutely should. But any sort of property sale revenue that would come in would be a one-time gap closure for any structural gap that happened. And then at a future year, we would be back at this table saying, okay, well, we had this one-time thing, so we chose not to adjust potentially. And then that means now we have to make a different kind of cut. And so the hope would be that we would use those revenues, should they happen, to create a more stable movement over time, that where our budget is responsive to both decreases and increases in student enrollment as opposed to major swings.
That's helpful. Yeah, I think my question was getting at more the second category of sort of what happens to the buildings that are no longer going to be used as fields, and whether there's any savings there, and like just upkeep and stuff over time. And I totally understand you haven't even gone through the consolidation process yet, much less thought about sort of what happens at the end of it. I was just sort of curious, even directionally, whether we were expecting any long-term changes there. And it sounds like I'm hearing no, or also maybe it's just TBD where we land. But I think your second part of what you answered is kind of what I was getting.
Yeah, I think that the board would have the authority to dispose of those property, and then we would go through the process. So it would be a board decision, and this body could certainly decide to make a recommendation to in some sort as part of your report as to if that were to happen, what you would recommend.
Yeah, that leads me to another question around property. So, you know, we sold that Washington building and that property, and now it's Revolution Hall and is great. And I know there's that like hesitation of like we could, if we sell that property, like is there value in that property that we could use in the future? Or I know Margaret Calvert has also shared like some of these properties, if there is consolidation, will also serve the purpose that Marshall serves right now for schools that are getting renovated. Like students have to be somewhere while their school is being renovated, so some of those buildings might be able to be used for that. But I'm wondering, you know, we have certain properties that we lease out and make revenue from that is not one time. And then I'm wondering where we would find that in the budget and how that funding is like then used. So I know we have some charter schools that pay rent. And then I also, and this is similar, if this is a can of worms we don't want to go down, that's fine. But I remember with part of the question for the center, the One North property, was the fact that we would have tenants in that building. And if there is any update around like, do we have tenants in that building? Are we making any revenue on that building? I know there were concerns about the cost of maintenance for that building. Is that something that we're seeing in this budget as well? Like where do some of the costs and also revenue from properties that we own that are not used exclusively for the function of school, where would that live in this budget?
Yeah, I think Alexandra has teed up the page that I would reference. So Alexandra, if you want to walk through the page number and then maybe zoom in a little bit so you can see the screen to walk through that.
Sure. So we're looking at the general fund resources by object report. We could look at how this looks at all funds, but just focusing on our operating budget for now. We have a few object codes or a couple of object codes where this would come up. So civic use of buildings, or CUB, would be one area where we have some fees that are charged to partners for usage of PPS space and provide some revenue here. So this is rounded to the thousands. So our estimate is 600,000 for the upcoming fiscal year. We also have rent lease of facilities here that is budgeted at 1 million for the upcoming fiscal year. Are there other areas, Tammy, where you would want to highlight lease proceeds?
Nope, that's exactly where I was looking. And I am not intentionally avoiding your One North question. I actually I'm writing a note to myself to make sure I get a comprehensive answer. The data is embedded in a department's budget that they've built, and it lands in these lines in aggregate. And I'll need to dig in to find out exactly where we're at on One North.
Awesome, thank you. So I know so we've kind of really focused on the transparency and legibility part of some of our recommendations, and as well as part of the like preservation of programs is where I would put some of that, the questions around access, like an ELD and all these things, like how are these funds being reduced and are they being reduced proportionally or not? And I'm wondering if folks have any other kind of recommendations under either those two topics, or any other themes that they might want to share now that we can start adding to a future document.
I don't know.
You're talking about access and ELD specifically? Sorry.
Oh, I meant like if there are any other programs or questions y'all have around those programs. I know I came in a little bit late, so I don't know if we got an answer to kind of the question around sports and how that's related to budgets and where in the budgets we'd see that. But I know that, one of the big themes that's one of the big themes that I've heard come up multiple times, and just wondering if there are additional pieces we want to add to recommendations, if we have any recommendations around those themes, the whole shebang.
And did I interrupt what you were going to say? I'm sorry.
Well, I was gonna go on a slightly different topic. So if we want to talk about this, that's totally fine. If not, I was just going to say I don't know if we've come to a consensus on Anne's point around like benchmarking, but I do think that is like a really good recommendation that we should be making, is that there should be some amount of, doesn't have to be every year, but there should be some consistent benchmark process. And I don't even know if we could lump that in with the theme of like alternative revenues and costs and those types of things. And it's just sort of like comparison of, like what we're spending and using and receiving compared to just our peers. Unless there already is a benchmark requirement, but it sounds like there actually isn't any type of benchmark requirement, which surprises me, frankly.
There have been some benchmarks completed to date as part of that ODE audit. There was a response to that with benchmarking as well that would be available. I don't know if that is on, Alexander, if that's on the website or available, if that's been made publicly available in the past, but that's something we could provide.
But it almost sounds like
as
it's been
well.
like, sorry. It sounds like it's almost like always been in reaction to something as opposed to like a proactive, like every 3 years we're going to get new benchmarks, or every 5 years or something like that. Some type of policy in that regard.
Earlier this year, as part of our budgeting process, we did engage with the same organization to do another benchmark for comparator districts. And they look at several things. The limited scope, and that's going to be true of just us finance staff as well, is access to information. So they have information based on other districts that have participated in benchmark, and then they look for the closest comparators within. And you'll always see some sort of difference there, but that's something that we can also provide. And as part of the organizational restructure that we've already seen here at central office, that part of that was in response to really a holistic look across, and benchmarking data helped inform that as well. So that is a part of our process, but what I'm hearing you say that's a little different than what's been done is really making that an annual process. One of the recommendations I would just selfishly hope this committee would come up with is what you would consider as important factors when considering what a peer district looks like,
right.
Because that is something that each person might have a different opinion on.
Yes, I agree, and I don't even know if it's necessarily CBRC's the right group to make the recommendation as to what should be a peer group, but I do agree. Like, I don't think we can just say like, oh, this is how we compare nationally to every single school district across the nation, right? Because PPS is very different than somewhere in the middle of the Midwest, rural Midwest, I'll say. So I do very much agree with that.
I would even ask Tammy, what would be, and Alexandra, what would be your recommendation? What should a good benchmarking program for PPS look like? Should it be annual? Should it be every 3 years? Is there a particular cadence? Is there a particular type of school district that makes a lot of sense? Do you have ideas that we can put into the recommendation or talk about?
I think most of my experience has been in Oregon K-12. And there is some power to understanding the nuance of Oregon, but then you're limited, right? To Beaverton, Salem Kaiser, you want to look at more than just student enrollment counts. So demographic makeup can be a really telling story, especially when you look at instruction versus support. And so then looking out across the nation, I think I brought up earlier tonight, one of the challenges I have trouble with is the age and quality of the building infrastructure that they're battling, and that being something that either needs to be called out or noted separately to pull that away in the data. We also face the challenge of reporting by state varies. So ODE has a prescriptive function object account code, and I'm going to say for the most part, districts are pretty good at following that. Because there isn't a lot of interpretation in there. Other states don't necessarily have the same structure or some comparison, or what they classify as a certain type of support FTE, we might actually consider to be more instructional. And you couldn't tell that in the accounting code or this. So there's a significant amount of work that goes into that. And not to say I think it's worth it. I would recommend every 3 to 5 years, and I think that would be best positioned with a board. Tammy's opinion here, a board plan, 3 to 5 year plan from the board, right? So you're aligning your recommendations on peer districts with kind of that guiding plan, and then that all moves together so that you can. That next cycle would then restart and give the board an opportunity to consider the direction that it wants the district to move towards. And I say board, but that can be superintendent and board. It doesn't necessarily need to be specifically board directed. 3 to 5 years for it's a significant level of work, and it's no secret that we're reducing staffing in the central office, and so having people to be able to do that work with fidelity and with intention will require a trade-off in what we're not doing. And that doesn't mean that we drop something important. I just want to be clear about that. It's just so also being mindful of competing priorities at the time. So then for me, selfishly, that looks like a summer project. I know that sounds a little crazy, but for others, the summer might be like, don't talk to me. That's my only time to take a break, and I don't want to focus.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And just to your point, if you look at the recommendation follow-up report from the Secretary of State, one of the recommendations is to conduct regular and public peer benchmarking to identify potential savings areas and spending challenges. And I'm reading directly, it's on page 12. Identify peer districts using objective criteria such as enrollment, level of poverty, and other demographic factors. So it kind of talks a little bit about that, and it says, at the time, as part of the quarterly financial reports to the school board, PPS produces a peer comparison and benchmark analysis based on other Oregon districts with over 10,000 students. District finance staff meet regularly with peers from other districts in this 10,000 student group. And PPS also participates in the Council of the Great City Schools benchmarking project, which allows PPS to compare its operations and performance to other large districts across the nation. So this is from that time. So things might have changed. And then it goes on to say, despite these benchmarking efforts, PPS provided no evidence the work has been used to identify savings areas and address spending challenges. District official state benchmarking is used in internal discussions, but this process is not transparent to the public or to policymakers. And while the district has publicly released benchmarking results, these are limited in choice of peer districts and level of financial details. And it says, including urban peers with demographics more comparable to PPS and other Oregon districts. So it talks a little bit about some of the ways that we can do benchmarking, whether it's enrollment or level of poverty or other demographic factors, because we are like one of the urban districts in the state that we might have to compare outside of state. But it also speaks a little bit to how some of this is kind of already done, but maybe that has changed since this report came out. Oh, Tammy and then Patty.
Oh, I was just going to offer that the CGCS, the Council of Great City Schools reporting, they switched their platform, and so they're a little bit behind in that collection. But we do participate, and it's coordinated through, so that is happening annually.
So thank you. Director Sullivan?
Yeah, I just wanted to apologize. I wasn't here at the last meeting, but I did look at the video, and I just want to say how impressed I am with the questions that are getting asked, and I think it's really going to make a difference. It hasn't always made a difference. I was on the board representative the last 2 years, and I have learned so much from you. Anyway, I just really want to tell you how much I appreciate your time, effort, and all your thoughts. It's been really helpful. I think it's probably helpful to Tammy and Michelle too, I can imagine. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, I know. I saw Julia in the chat. You shared asking ChatGPT about similar school district size issues, goals, and it gave San Francisco, Seattle, and Denver. I know in the audit, Seattle is one that we're compared to, as well as Beaverton when it comes to some different parts. And I wonder if it's worth, not to be the teacher that gives folks homework, but if it's worth looking through the audits to see if there's any trends or questions that because I'm hearing a lot of things that I'm like, I think I've read that before, and it's been in the audits, and there might be some details that would help us with our recommendations if they are similar to what's already been recommended. And the updated one was 2022, so it is about 4 years out of date. But if it hasn't changed in 4 years, maybe it's something we want to also continue to recommend. But I know that other school districts, Sacramento is similar size as well, and has also dealt with the school closure conversations and student population declining, and pretty similar levels of diversity, maybe a little bit more. Yeah. So I wonder if at this point,
Hey, Angela, I just
Yeah.
want to, it was kind of crickets after you asked about sports, and
I know
were
that
you
was your
asked?
question.
Yeah, and I was more curious how it's part of the budget, and I really appreciate that. Is there anything to talk about? I didn't know exactly who you were asking the question to.
Yeah, I know that it came up. Who owns the work? How is it funded? How are those decisions made around budgets, extracurriculars? Is it district level, building level? And so I guess my wonder, I know that we were told it's on page 101 of the budget at the very bottom.
Right.
So that's general fund details, but I'm wondering if there's any other questions that maybe you had, or deeper questions past what we asked previously around sports. And
I guess really maybe my only question would be has it changed? Is it changed has it changed from, and I can't really the numbers are too small for me for my eyes to see. Thank you. Thank you. From like over the years, has there been any significant change in the budget allocation for sports? And if so, why? But it seems like only a few sports are listed.
So the question from last week, just as a reminder, if I remember correctly, was focused on any proceeds that were collected as part of the athletics program. So how do we plan for the revenue on the resource side? So that's what this is presenting here. We have some pay to play fees, and admission fees here, including football admissions, with the highest revenue estimated at 120,000. So those are some of the revenues that we expect for those programs. And the question from last week was also around expense, and Director Booth did, I thought, a great job responding to some of that, but I don't know if it offered the amount of detail that was requested around that would be more focused on the expense side. And we have prepared, we'll include that response in our tracking log so folks can read through it versus having to go and look at the minutes or other sources to find the information. I don't know, Tammy, if you would want to remind folks of what you shared last week around the expenses.
I think I was just sharing that there was a significant difference between what is funded through the general fund versus the revenue that we collect. And to answer your question very directly, yes, that has varied over time. Are we looking at significant swings for next year? The answer is no, we are not. What that looks like in practice, and I kind of alluded to, like, Marshall's going to know the details, the athletic director. The details on the specifics, but that looks like OSAA sports versus club sports and what we add and fund through that process, and the number and the quantity and in which we're funding there. And so it doesn't look like less, although there will be less. It's my understanding there will be less coaching staff for next year, and that will look like different levels of students on a team versus the number of coaches they will have access to. But I would need to pull the more granular data to give more detail on there if that's something that the CVRC wants to add to their report, and this would help.
I think only if there was like significant change, or, and it sounds like there's not.
I'm just pulling a couple things in the background here, and my computer is running just a little slow. But looking over the budget, looks like, yeah, there'll be a modest increase there. Is there a function code associated? I don't think there is specifically.
I don't see that level of
Okay,
detail.
yeah. I had a suspicion it was going to land in a function. School administrative service area direction. 11322. So high school extracurricular. That's where you're going to see that come through. And so you can see here that there was a reduction in the budget in 25-26. And then 26-27 is maintaining that high school extracurricular.
So is that in the high school extracurricular, the adopted amount, and then is increasing between or excuse me, the amount is increasing between the adopted of 25-26 and the proposed for 26-27, but the budgeted FTE is going down. So that means that the funds are increasing to support things outside of FTE.
I would want to pull the details there to be sure. There's thousands of lines, so I'm kind of scrambling on the side. But yes, that is how I would read that. Yes, that the FTE associated with that function are being reduced in that function area. What I want to double check is because I see an increase, very modest, in middle school extracurricular. I don't know if there was a shift, so I want to make sure there wasn't any sort of shifting happening as opposed to true reduction.
Got it.
Given
Yeah.
the size of our reductions, I doubt that would be the case.
Yeah.
And I also believe that 1132 as a function code is going to probably hold more than just athletics. And so I don't want to leave the impression that that is equal to athletics.
Got it.
So I want to make sure that's a very clear picture of what's happening. There's not necessarily a one-to-one, but it's possible.
So that could be like, if you have a forensics team at a high school that has to do trips to competitions or something, that might be a high school extracurricular that's non-sport that is connected to that.
Potentially, yes. Yeah.
Okay. So, just thinking about our time and the time we have left tonight, I was trying to kind of like pull out some of the themes that have continued into maybe some next time providing kind of that list as like recommendation areas, and then we can talk through like what those recommendations would be. So I'll just read out what I have so far, and then ask if it would be helpful for me to just kind of like gather all that and send that out so we can start talking through what we might want to recommend through those categories. So the first I have, oh, go ahead, Anne.
Do we have quorum? There was an issue at the beginning of the call where we couldn't make any decisions because there weren't enough people here. So we should figure out if we have enough people to decide anything.
Great question. What is technically our quorum for this body?
We have 13 voting members. Our quorum would be 7. So 50% plus 1. I'm just counting our participants now.
We do not have quorum.
Yeah.
So, thank you, Anne. And I wasn't planning on voting on anything tonight. I just wanted to see if just a general like straw poll, are these the thing? Am I hearing this correctly? Is there some wax in the ear that I'm missing something? So the first one is transparency and legibility for the public. A recommendation around like volumes should have more differentiation between schools, construction, central office, making it a priority next year to focus on legibility, discussing benchmarking, discussing the limitation of use of dollars between the different funds, so that's transparent. Another one is recommending alternative funding and expense sources. So changes to fundraising, alternatives for contracting services, because there is a large increase there. There is something also I wanted to bring up around, with the MODA Center investments by the state and the county and the city. What would it look like to maybe discuss like a community benefits agreement with the MODA Center to help fund our own sports or other things, but just other, like, what are some other ways that we can increase alternative funding and expense sources? Another theme is that I think we keep coming back to is the encouraging advocacy at the state level, especially around PERS and the UAL. I think you talked about this today, Anne, with the like parsing out some of the costs from the state school fund that are not actually going to students, like PERS and health insurance. Like, how do we make it clear when we're advocating what needs to change? And then something around the preservation of programs, like how are funds being reduced proportionally or not, talking about tag, transportation, which is like a whole different budget line item, but just something to consider as we're talking about equity across programs, ELD, DLI, alphabet soup. But those were kind of the themes that I kept hearing from the last play time and then into this one. Anne, go ahead.
Add one there, Angela. Just as long as we're in alphabet soup. I believe two of the programs that are significantly impacted by the reduction in staff are the ELL programs, and I believe it's the less restrictive programs. So I don't want just tag to get brought up because those are the parents on the committee. Like there are multiple specific programs that are meaningfully and directly impacted at a greater rate than the school district as a whole.
Yeah, would you give some examples of those less restrictive programs?
Hand that off to Alexandra or Tammy. All
Are
I see
you
is the line item.
So I was going to ask a question when you're referring to the less restrictive programs.
I might be
function
remembering that
code.
also.
No, when you're looking at that function code specifically, are you looking at the all funds or the general fund page?
I'm recalling
And
something.
the reason I'm asking,
And I was looking at the FTE page, the change in FTE page where it's summarized and it says which program loses FTE. It's one of the summary pages. It wasn't the regular budget.
so when I look at the all funds, I see an increase of 1.72 FTE under the less restrictive programs. When I look at the general fund, I do see a decrease. This is one of those, and I'm honing in hyper specific here because this is one of those areas where you're going to see us leaning into our grant funds where appropriate to help with this so that we're maintaining services and supports to students without reducing staffing. So in this page, you should see that maintain FTE. But if we go to the general fund, you're going to see what's going to look like a little bit of what I would call like a shocking decline in Gen Fund comparatively. And I wonder if that's where you were at. And this is the exact example I was trying to use as why we would need an all funds report and not just rely on an individual fund, because this is not telling the right story on its own.
All funds except for the capital building, that 1.4 billion that dilutes it all and makes it messy. I'm otherwise like, I will look and see if this isn't the one I was looking at, but I'm going to put low confidence on that right now. Let me go look and see while Angela's continuing.
Okay.
Yeah, because when I look up the definition in the budget book about less restrictive programs, it's short for less restrictive programs for students with disabilities. So special learning experiences for students with disabilities outside the regular classroom, like resource rooms or learning centers where students go during the day, instructional specialists, our supports for paras in gen ed classrooms, autism services, deaf and hard of hearing, visually impaired services, etc.
Just as an aside, compliments to Alexandra for like pumping through that 300-page document in a matter of seconds when we just randomly bring up topics. Very impressive.
There's someone else who knows it.
Yeah.
I just want to jump on real quick for a time check. I know we're nearing the end of our time, and I wanted to make sure that we can share our meeting schedule with you for deliverables. I know that you're still waiting on answers from us, which we're racing to get as quickly as possible. And we also have a deadline coming up that is only a couple days away for finalizing a report. And so what I'd like to propose is if this group could identify which questions we should put 1,000% of our effort into to get as quickly as possible to help with that report building. And then we'll, of course, with anything that's a low lift that we can get quickly, we're also going to turn over so that we can make sure that we're able to deliver everything we can. And I'll pause there for student voice.
Hi, yeah, I might have missed this, but I'm wondering if I could get like a better, or we could get a better understanding of like what the report is supposed to look like, or like what previous reports have looked like, or just sort of like the format of that and the way that's structured. I think that would be helpful for me at least. Was that something that was already discussed, or was that?
I don't believe this has been discussed in the group space yet. I don't believe you missed this. I am screen sharing right now the report that was produced last spring by our committee. So the CBRC, I can walk through it very quickly. This report from this year was broken out into background and purpose, focusing on the charge of the CBRC, and then the purpose of the budget review. They provided overall reflections with kind of guiding principles around direct impact to students and staff, discussed budget context, long-term outlook, areas of inquiry, similar to what we're discussing right now, observations on staffing and student impacts. There was a benchmarking recommendation in this report as well. There was a specific focus on Title I changes, and then impact to student supports, equity funding, blended classrooms also came up in this report. Assessment alignment came up, similar to this year's conversation. Operational efficiency, similar to this year. Enrollment, which was a question that has been asked already. Attendance and addressing chronic absenteeism was a focus. The bond, there was also similar discussion around transparency in the bond, revenue diversification, asset management around buildings and reserves and one-time spending. And that kind of wrapped up the report here. The committee also produces a local option levy report, which has been linked separately as an example for how the committee looked at that last year.
Cool, thank you.
And I did paste the final CBRC report link in the chat. Again, saying it out loud. So chat's not visible publicly, just so that if you wanted to click on that, Eli, and look at it yourself, you could. Yeah.
How does the report get written? Who writes it? How does it get written? How do we do that?
At a really practical level, usually in the past, we would have the report created during these meetings. And so similar to this meeting, there would be some discussion that happens early on in the process. And then as staff support, myself or other staff would take notes and screen share during that note taking. So you could see what was being recorded. It would be a group document that the CBRC members would then contribute to. Gotcha. And they would write portions of it with some kind of outline that had already been created from the meeting.
Thank you.
Oof. All right. We're at 7:30. I feel like thank you for that explanation, Alexandra, because it definitely is like, we are far from that right now. That doesn't mean that we can't get there. So Before I adjourn the meeting, just wanting to acknowledge that Mignana put in the chat. I noticed that legal consulting and professional services are bundled together in the budget under a 1.7 million reduction. There isn't a clear breakdown of what portion is legal versus consulting or other services. Has there been any additional detail shared on this, or has the group already discussed it? As far as I know, we haven't discussed it, but that's a great question to add to our questions during meetings document. I'm hoping maybe when we meet next on Wednesday, I can share out what what I've read out loud as like the themes that I'm seeing, and folks can maybe ponder on that, think about that, and then when we come back on Wednesday, we can talk a little bit about the outline and start working on the actual report. And hopefully we'll have enough quorum to do some votes next meeting. Otherwise, we'll likely have to figure out another meeting in order to take votes and finalize the report. All right. Any last questions or comments for the good of the order? Yes, Anne.
Can we email people and tell them to come on Wednesday, or else we're going to need them again?
Will do,
Schedule again
yes.
seems unlikely within this timeline. Can we let people know we really need you there? And if you have restrictions, maybe they could let us know what those are, and we could try and get important votes while people are available.
Yeah, I like that heard, and let your staff support. We will coordinate to do something and share the urgency. Thank you.
Yeah,
I just wanted
appreciate
to
that.
mention that
Yes.
unfortunately I have class. I'm getting my master's right now, and it's every Wednesday evening. So I try to attend when I can. I try to do the two at one time. It doesn't work for me at all. I am reviewing all the documents and information. So unfortunately, I'm not going to be present, but if there is another time, I can definitely make time in my schedule.
Thank you for letting us know. Yeah. So, folks want to leave us with before I dismiss I adjourn us. All right. At 7:33, I will call this meeting adjourned. Thank you so much, everyone, for your work tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank
All
you.
right. Take care, y'all.